You could argue Returnal was a touch niche, but that niche identity is exactly what made it unforgettable. Saros feels like a very polished, marketable AAA evolution of that formula. And while that makes it easier to recommend to more people, it also makes it feel less unique. But look, at the end of the day, Saros is a great game. New players will probably find it challenging, rewarding, visually impressive, and extremely enjoyable.
From the start, let me be clear, Saros is a very good game. But anybody wanting a more accessible version of what Housemarque does best, you cannot genuinely go wrong with Saros. It also has to be said that comparisons with their previous masterpiece Returnal cannot be avoided. For all intents and purposes, this is a sequel to Returnal in everything but name. And Housemarque have made some interesting choices, slight diversions from that original masterpiece that need to be scrutinised and questioned. Because though I feel Saros is a fantastic game in its own right, it without a doubt feels like a ever so slightly, maybe more than that, diluted version of Returnal. Difficulty-wise, philosophically, narratively, and structurally, Saros feels like a nod to accessibility over accomplishment. And that doesn't mean Saros is a bad game, not by any stretch of the imagination. You cannot help but feel, especially after finishing Saros twice, that it drifts away from the exact principles that made Returnal a modern day classic. When I look back at Returnal, one of the defining memories of a run of Returnal is that clean play mattered. If you avoided damage, maintained adrenaline, played aggressively but carefully, and understood enemy patterns, the game rewarded you consistently. Your success was basically tied directly to mechanical execution. Saros isn't really designed like that. It definitely forgives you for more mistakes, and ultimately, through its Armour Matrix system, rewards you handsomely for regular failures. Now, meta progression is nothing new in games like Returnal or Saros. However, I do feel that Housemarque got the power curve of the Armour Matrix ever so slightly wrong, and that slight error in landing the Armour Matrix does have a large impact on the difficulty of Saros. The final result being, honestly, a game that just didn't feel as rewarding to complete as Returnal did, whether that be on a boss-by-boss basis or just at the end of the game. In Returnal, surviving felt empowering, a vindication of the struggles you'd been through. In Saros, progression is just expected eventually. Once you reach a certain threshold on the Armour Matrix, it seems almost inevitable that you're going to get through the area you're stuck in. Now, that's not to say there isn't a sense of mastery in Saros. The parrying and orb absorbing mechanic are definitely part of the core damage loop that can lead to a kind of flow state. However, the iframes or the animations on those are so forgiving. As a person who regards himself as a slightly above average gamer, I didn't feel that there were really skill checks on those mechanics. They were pretty easy to nail down, to the point that most boss fights had many attacks that can just be parried through and absorbed, leading to a very safe boss kill. And as I said at the start, this is definitely a shift towards accessibility. And in the long term, for Housemarque's bottom line and for Sony's bottom line, that may not be a bad thing. But for hardcore Returnal fanboys, it definitely lacked that fist-pumping, oh my god, I killed the boss moments that Returnal had. And that's not to say the Saros boss fights are not grand in spectacle or execution, but in terms of accomplishment, I did feel they were a touch lacking. I have some other minor knocks for Saros as well. Enemy design or enemy variety, more to the point, it's just not good enough. There's a lot of repetition, a lot of the enemy patterns are very repetitive as well. Environment design can feel a bit samey at times. I do feel there are some standouts, such as the cathedral, but overall it just didn't have that horror-esque feeling that Returnal had. Returnal felt like a world that was just hostile to you. It was like a virus attacking you at all times. The actual world itself, not just the enemies, that just isn't the case in Saros. Saros without a doubt has better graphics. I mean, just technically it looks better. Then onto the weapons, and I do have some issues with the weapons, and I think it's mostly an accumulation of the issues brought on from the overdrive, power weapon, dodge and parry system, and absorb system that then feeds into the weapons almost feeling secondary to those skills that you're given, to those damage avoidance skills and opportunities you get. Because of how meaningful, let's say, an absorb or a parry can be to your power weapon economy. Taking a weapon that doesn't have auto-aim on it or doesn't have power generator on it just seems almost pointless. Like, you would almost never choose a weapon that doesn't have power generator on it or doesn't have some form of auto-aim on it, because you've got so much to do, and those can be such powerful mechanics in terms of generating DPS that I felt it unnecessary to take any other option. And I never really felt there was the similar feeling of, let's say, in Returnal, getting a Hollow Seeker or a, what's it called, the Rock Land Lobber or whatever it was called. I mean, those type of weapons could completely transform a run. While in Saros, you were more hoping for a good perk on those weapons than you were for the weapon itself. And that sadly goes further into the power weapons, where the initial power weapon you get, I believe it was called the Prominence if I remember correctly, is just easily the best option for a variety of reasons, from its perks such as vacuum and homing missiles to the sheer amount of damage that it does, the explosion radius which can be buffed with stats, and the fact that you don't have to hold on to the left trigger, I believe it is, to use that weapon, therefore freeing up your hands for other evasive maneuvers. And some would say I'm being really picky here, but I think if you just add all these little incremental things together, you do end up with it just taken away from the edge, like the sharp edges of Returnal. And following on to this, you have the artifacts and builds which just don't matter enough. I mean, half the time you just briefly glance at it, make sure it didn't have some crazy negative effect. The worst one being the dash delay, I believe it was, a perk which I would never take. Other than that, these are basically stat boosts with some nice quality of life added on top, but never were they run defining, as parasites so often could be in Returnal. And of course, by the time you're leveled up further, Arjun is so powerful that these attributes you find are just even less impactful. In fact, you're way better just not taking a artifact if it had something like a dash delay on it than you are then taking the artifact and the artifact boost, because you're so powerful just from the Armour Matrix. And this again funnels into exploration, where exploration is fun in a way. Like, these kind of laser-based puzzles they have are quite fun. I found them fun anyway. But they do take away from your health, but then to make up for it, the game just throws health orbs at you like gummies. So kind of like, what was the point? And again, feeding back into the previous weapon and attribute criticisms I had, the rewards at the end never really felt great unless you got some Halcyon, which is super rare. So, you know, it was always good to get an Halcyon if you went through a puzzling system, or a big health drop if you had taken a lot of damage previously. But there was never a moment in Saros where I got a drop and I thought, oh yes, that has saved my run, or that has really boosted, that's going to help me kill the next boss. Other than the aforementioned power generator based weapon or a high level prominence with vacuum on it or homing missile, I didn't really blink at a lot of the other options that were presented to me. Which nicely leads us into the difficulty curve, or more to the point, the Armour Matrix curve. Adding to the parry mechanics and the absorb mechanic, which kind of mess with the difficulty curve, you then have the Armour Matrix in itself, which by the time you get to the second to last biome just makes you so powerful that a lot of the runs feel like a procession rather than Returnal's agonizing room by room survival mode. And because all of these feed into this power mechanic DPS kind of system, it snowballs big time into you just feeling like an absolute monster, and rather than you being the hunted, you become the hunter. And you could argue that the absorb and parry mechanics give skill expression, but the frames allowed, the invincibility frames and the windows allowed for those moves are just too kind. And as a result, I just don't think Saros allows for as much precision or mastery as Returnal demanded. Now, I know what you're going to be saying, the carcosan modifiers, they can artificially add difficulty. Here's the thing, I believe a developer has a duty to provide the game out of the box to the player that meets the intended goal that the developer wanted. That should be the product that the player initially faces. Because nobody, I think, is going to go into Saros on the first run through and just whack up the modifiers, because you don't know how difficult the game is, you don't know how easy or hard it is. So you are going to play as intended, and as intended, I do feel a lot of these systems are off. And in my opinion, after now finishing Saros twice, I do feel like the carcosan modifier system is an admittance or an acknowledgement by Housemarque that yes, this game is made for accessibility and a bit more fun to allow more players to come into the Housemarque world. And for those hardened players, the carcosan modifier system's there to make it feel more like Returnal. I, for one, am not a huge fan of developers doing that. I would rather it be on the more difficult side to allow players to then scale it back, rather than it be on the easier side and then make players scale it up on a second or third run through. Other minor gripes, arena design. Sometimes I felt like the arenas and the enemy placements were almost always at long range, meaning a weapon such as the shotgun, for example. In most arenas, not all, the shotgun has some very strong moments, but generally speaking, you would almost never choose a shotgun. The enemies are way too far away, you have to get much closer. And when the range weapons are so strong in terms of viability, It just felt like the shotgun was pushed aside. Maybe I just love shotguns, and I do love shotguns. But I just felt the shotgun just wasn't a good choice here. On the flip side as well, though, sometimes they'll shrink the movement space of the levels, but then have gaps which you can fall through. And I think I probably lost more health to falling down gaps than I did from actually getting hit by enemies. I did feel that Returnal's story was absolutely brilliant. It had enough mystery in it, and then this huge kind of reveal and gut punch towards the back end, which felt like a rewarding payoff that they had earned. Though I actually think Saros tells a much more grounded story than Returnal, I don't think it tells as much of an emotional story as Returnal, and I guess that's horses for courses. That's down to personal opinion as to what you like. Carcosan feels like a real place affecting real people, and that grounding helps certain emotional moments land better structurally, I guess, but emotionally, it just isn't there. Returnal's story, themes, pace, and a psychological horror all merge into something incredibly cohesive towards the back end. It really did feel like a genuine artistic vision, a true sci-fi horror masterpiece. Saros has some very strong ideas based around greed and want, selfishness and power, but the ending just didn't quite deliver that jaw-dropping wow moment that I felt Returnal did. So to really summarize my issues with Saros, it's not that I think it's a bad game by any stretch. I loved Saros. I think it's an excellent game. It's a fun arcade shooter, but it just isn't Returnal, and not many games are, and that's totally fine. Saros was purposely designed to be more accessible. I think that's clear now when you take into account the Armour Matrix, the carcosan modifier, and the just general out-of-the-box difficulty of the game. And accessibility itself isn't bad, but in making the experience broader and more marketable, something got lost in the wash. The tension, the intensity, the oppressive sci-fi horror atmosphere, the feeling that every run demanded absolute focus and borderline perfection. You could argue that's tiring, you could argue Returnal was a touch niche, but that niche identity is exactly what made it unforgettable. Saros feels like a very polished, marketable AAA evolution of that formula. And while that makes it easier to recommend to more people, it also makes it feel less unique. But look, at the end of the day, Saros is a great game. New players would probably find it challenging, rewarding, visually impressive, and extremely enjoyable. But for people who loved Returnal, for the veterans, for those who still remark to this day Returnal is the best PlayStation 5 game released, this isn't really the Returnal 2 experience many of us hoped for. And honestly, that's okay. You can't make a masterpiece every time. And comparing the two isn't about tearing Saros down. It's about discussing the direction Housemarque decided to take after creating what many people now consider a sleeper classic of the PlayStation 5 era, because Returnal wasn't just a great roguelike, it was brilliant art. I know this video sounds like a bit of a bashing of Saros, it's really not meant to be, but I think when discussing the two games and discussing the issues between them, you have to get into the nitty-gritty detail of what makes a game tick, and that's basically what I was trying to do here. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your comments, please, if you can, and yeah, peace. Subscribe, like, it helps me out a ton. Thank you.